The kingdom of Dareth had stood for 500 years on the bones of its traditions. Its skies ran deep violet at dusk, the kind of purple that looked borrowed from royalty itself, heavy, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The mountains that framed its borders were ancient and scarred, and the forests between them whispered in a language that only wolves could understand. Dareth was not a gentle place. It was a place that demanded you belong, or be swallowed whole. Every year, when the harvest moon hung fat and low over the great hall of the royal palace, the kingdom gathered for the sacred mating ceremony, the most anticipated and carefully guarded event in all of Dareth. Wolves, pure-blooded and proud, would dress in their finest and fill the grand hall with laughter and the rich earthy scent of pine and amber. They came to find their fated mates. They came to continue the bloodlines that had carried their civilization since the very beginning. Only pure bloods were welcomed there. That was not a rule written in any formal decree. It did not need to be. It was simply understood. And Herdis had spent most of her 23 years understanding exactly where she did not belong. She was not pure blood. She was not fully wolf. Her mother had been a quiet, brilliant woman with silver-streaked hair and amber eyes, who had loved a human man so completely and so foolishly that she had given him everything, including a daughter, before he walked away and never came back. Herdis had been 7 years old the first time someone called her half-blood, like it was a slur. She had been 9 the first time she truly understood what it meant. And by the time she was 12 and her mother had died of a grief so deep it had eaten through her like rot in good wood, Herdis had learned the most important lesson of her life. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. Stay on the outskirts where no one looks. She had done exactly that for 11 years. She had built a life at the edge of the kingdom, in a small stone cottage near the river where the forest began. She foraged, she traded at the outer market, she kept to herself. She had Janina, her closest friend, a full-blooded wolf with raven hair and a laugh that could shake the walls, and she had Eichel, her childhood companion, steady and sandy-haired and endlessly patient. That was enough. That had always been enough. Until Eichel was chosen. The news came on a Tuesday morning, carried by a messenger in royal colours who looked slightly confused about why anyone important would live this far from the palace. Eichel had been selected as a companion mate to one of the senior pack members, a rare and significant honour. The ceremony would be held at the Grand Hall in 3 days. He had sent Herdis a handwritten invitation almost immediately after, the ink still slightly smudged from how fast he had written it. "Please come. I don't want to do this without you nearby. You don't have to stay long. Just be there." Janina had shown up at the cottage that same evening, already holding a dress. "You're going," Janina said, before Herdis could even open her mouth. "Don't argue with me." "They'll know what I am the moment I walk in," Herdis said quietly. "They will stare for 30 seconds, Janina replied. "And then they will find someone more interesting to gossip about. Wolves have short attention spans and very long egos. Trust me." Herdis had almost smiled at that. Almost. She went. Not because she had convinced herself it would be fine. Not because she believed she belonged there. She went because Eichel had never once in his entire life made her feel like an outsider, and that was a debt she would spend the rest of her life repaying in small, quiet ways. So she put on the deep green dress Janina had brought. She pinned her dark brown hair back, the few silver strands catching the candlelight like threads of moonlight, and she walked into the grand hall of the royal palace of Dareth for the very first time. The hall was breathtaking. The ceiling soared 40 feet above the marble floor, draped in silk of gold and deep crimson. Crystal lanterns floated in arrangements that mimicked the constellation patterns sacred to Dareth's wolf clans. The scent of lavender and pine was so thick it felt almost solid. Wolves in their finest clothing filled every corner, laughing, embracing, presenting their bloodlines to one another with the specific kind of pride that people reserve for things they did nothing to earn. Herdis found a seat near the back, behind a column, where the light was dimmer and the crowd was thinner. She folded her hands in her lap and reminded herself this would be over in 2 hours. She would watch Eichel's ceremony. She would smile. She would leave before anyone noticed her. She was very nearly right. Then the doors at the front of the hall opened. The room went silent the way a held breath goes silent, complete, sudden, and full of weight. Ralph, the Alpha King of Dareth, walked in. He was taller than the stories made him, 6 feet and 4 inches of controlled authority, dressed in black and silver, with a royal cloak that moved behind him like a living shadow. His dark, wavy hair fell to his shoulders, and his golden eyes swept the hall with the calm, practiced precision of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. His jaw was sharp. His posture was the posture of someone who had never once in his life had to make himself take up more space. He simply did, naturally, without trying. Herdis looked away immediately. That was instinct, self-preservation. Do not make eye contact with power, especially power you have no business being near. She stared at her hands. She counted to 10. She looked up. Ralph had stopped walking. In the middle of the grand hall, surrounded by 500 wolves who were all pretending not to hold their breath, the Alpha King had stopped. His golden eyes had traveled across the room with their usual sweep. And then they had caught on something. On someone. And they had not moved since. On her. Herdis felt the blood leave her face. She did not move. She did not breathe. She sat behind her column in her green dress with her silver-threaded hair. And she thought, very clearly, this is exactly what I was afraid of. Ralph's head tilted, just slightly, the way a wolf tilts its head when it catches a scent it has never encountered before. Curious, alert, and absolutely certain that something significant is happening. He took 1 step toward her, then another. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if this story already has your heart doing something it should not be doing, that means it is working exactly the way it was meant to. Before we go any further, and I promise you, what is coming next is going to change everything. Thank you so much for being here. It genuinely means the world to us. Stories like this one only reach the people who need them because of viewers who choose to show up and stay. Please hit that subscribe button right now, smash the like, and drop a comment below, telling us where in the world you are watching from. The walk from the entrance of the hall to the column where Herdis sat took Ralph approximately 14 steps. She counted every single one of them, because counting gave her something to do, besides panic. The crowd parted for him without being asked. That was the thing about genuine authority. It did not need to announce itself. People simply moved, the way water moves around stone, unconsciously, inevitably. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, the golden eyes were even more unsettling. Not because they were unkind, but because they were completely, utterly focused. There was no performance in them, no political warmth, just direct, undisguised attention. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it carry farther than if he had shouted. "I know," Herdis said. She was proud of how steady her voice came out. She was slightly less proud of the fact that she had to grip the edge of her chair to keep her hands still. I was invited by Eichel. He is being bonded tonight. I came for him, not for— That's not what I meant, Ralph said. She blinked. What I mean, he continued, is that your scent is not in the registry. Every wolf in this kingdom is catalogued by the time they are 16. I have memorized every scent profile of every pack member in Dareth. He paused. His expression shifted, not into confusion, but into something more serious. I do not know yours, and I have never, in 16 years of rule, encountered a scent I did not recognize. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Herdis had ever heard. She should have denied it. She should have said she was a human visitor, a servant, someone's cousin from outside the borders. She had a dozen safe answers rehearsed and ready in the back of her mind, but something about those golden eyes made every lie she owned feel useless. I live on the outskirts, she said carefully. I have for most of my life. I was never formally registered because— She stopped. Because, he prompted. Because I am not fully a wolf, she said. There it was, the truth, naked and cold on the floor between them. My father was human. My mother has been gone for 11 years. There was no one to register me, and no one who thought it mattered enough to try. Something moved through Ralph's expression. She could not name it. It was not pity. She would have recognized pity. She had been on the receiving end of it enough times. It was not disgusting either, though she had braced for that. It was something quieter and more complicated, something that looked almost like recognition. "What is your name?" he asked. "Herdis." He repeated it once, very quietly, as if testing the weight of it. Then, to the visible horror of every council member watching from across the room, the Alpha King of Dareth pulled out the empty chair beside Herdis and sat down. The scandal travelled through the hall like electricity. Herdis could hear the whispers beginning at the edges, low, urgent, scandalized. A half-blood, seated beside the king. At the sacred ceremony, she wanted to slide under the table and live there permanently. "You do not have to look quite so horrified," Ralph said dryly. "I am told I am passably pleasant company." Herdis stared at him. "Or did you just— Was that a joke?" "I have them occasionally," he said. "They surprise everyone, including me." Despite every reasonable instinct she possessed, Herdis laughed. It was a small laugh, startled out of her, and she covered it quickly with her hand. But it had happened, and based on the slight shift at the corner of Ralph's mouth, he had noticed. Across the room, Janina caught Herdis's eye and made a face that communicated approximately 7 different emotions at once, all of them variations of what in the name of every wolf ancestor is happening right now. Herdis had no answer for her. What she did know was this: the Alpha King had just sat beside her in front of 500 wolves, and the night was very far from over. And somewhere in the back of her mind, where she kept all the things she refused to think about, a door she had kept locked for years was beginning, very slowly, to crack open. She did not know it yet, but it was already too late to stop it. The morning after, everything changed. Herdis was awake before sunrise. She had been awake for most of the night, which was its own kind of punishment. She sat at the small wooden table in her kitchen, with both hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea, staring at nothing, running the previous evening through her mind like a piece of fabric she was checking for flaws. Ralph had sat beside her through the entirety of Eichel's bonding ceremony. He had not made a spectacle of it. He spoke quietly when he spoke at all, and asked questions about the outskirts of the kingdom, what it was like, what the people there needed, whether the trade roads were maintained properly. Practical questions, and the questions of someone who actually ran a kingdom rather than merely performed it. And then, when the ceremony had ended, he stood, thanked her for the conversation with a formality that somehow didn't feel cold, and walked back to his council table. He had said nothing about meeting again. He had given her no indication that the conversation had meant anything beyond a brief curiosity. She should have been relieved. She was not relieved. She was the opposite of relieved, which was deeply inconvenient. Janina arrived at 7 in the morning with bread, cheese, and absolutely no intention of leaving until she had extracted every detail. "Start from the beginning," Janina said, pulling up a chair with the energy of someone settling in for a very long story. "And do not leave anything out. I saw his face when he looked at you, Herdis. And I need you to tell me what that conversation was about, because from where I was standing, it was nothing," Herdis said. "His face," Janina said firmly, "was not a nothing face. That was a very specific face. That was the face of a man who had just found something he did not know he was looking for." "You are reading into it," Herdis said. "He was curious about my scent. I'm unregistered. I'm probably a security irregularity to him." A security irregularity he sat beside for 2 hours. Herdis did not have a response to that. What she had instead was a knock at the door. A royal knock. 3 precise, evenly spaced strikes that somehow communicated authority through 2 inches of solid wood. Janina and Herdis stared at each other. Herdis opened the door. It was not Ralph. It was Kastner, the king's advisor, a silver-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed in dark robes, adorned with the insignia of the royal court. He looked at Herdis the way one looks at a piece of evidence that keeps appearing at inconvenient crime scenes. "Miss Herdis," Kastner said, his voice carrying the careful precision of a man who chose every word with the deliberateness of placing tiles in a mosaic. "The Alpha King requests your presence at the palace this afternoon. 2 o'clock. He wishes to continue your conversation from last evening." He paused. "He also asked me to tell you that it is not a summons. It is an invitation." The distinction, he said, was important. He handed her a sealed letter. The royal wax of Dareth pressed into the crimson seal and left without waiting for an answer. Behind her, Janina made a sound that was somewhere between a shriek and a laugh. "A security irregularity," Janina said. "Stop," Herdis said. "An invitation, Herdis, not a summons." He sent his personal advisor before breakfast to clarify that distinction. "I heard him. I just want to make sure we are both understanding the level of specific effort that it took." Herdis looked at the letter in her hand. The seal was unbroken. It was the first piece of royal correspondence she had ever held. It was heavier than she expected. The most important things were. She went to the palace. The palace library was 3 floors tall, lined floor to ceiling with books that smelled of age and authority. It was where Ralph received her, not the throne room, not the formal council chamber, but the library. She would learn later that he spent most of his free hours here, and that inviting someone to the library was, for Ralph, the equivalent of trust. She did not know that yet. She simply noticed that he looked less like a king in here. He had shed the royal cloak. He was in dark trousers and a simple shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a book open on the table in front of him. He stood when she entered, and there was nothing performative about it, just a man acknowledging the arrival of someone he had been waiting for. "You came," he said. "Your advisor was very persuasive," she said. Or Kastner is persuasive in the way that stone walls are persuasive, Ralph said. Present, immovable, and slightly intimidating. I apologize if he alarmed you. He gestured to a chair across from the table, and she sat. And for a moment, they simply regarded each other across the old wood and the open books. I want to be honest with you, Ralph said at last. I spent most of last night in this room. I pulled every record, every registry document, every bloodline archive we have from the past century. He paused. I found your mother. The room felt different suddenly. Her name was Aldis, he continued quietly. She was registered as a young woman from a pack in the northern borders. What the records also show, and this was not in any summary document, but only in the original archive, is that your mother's bloodline is directly descended from the Solvane line. Herdis had never heard that name, but something about it moved through her like a current. The Solvane wolves, Ralph said, were the original settlers of Dareth, before the packs formed, before the council was established, before the traditions were written down. The Solvane wolves are the reason this kingdom exists at all, and according to our oldest records, records that most of the council has never read because they have not needed to, there is a prophecy that has been tied to the Solvane bloodline for 300 years. He slid a book across the table. It was old enough that the leather cover had gone soft, worn dark at the edges. She opened it to the page he had marked. The writing was in old script, dense and deliberate, but she could read it. She had always been a reader. Her mother had made sure of that, pressed books into her hands from the time she could hold them, perhaps knowing that books were the one thing that could not be taken away. She read. Then she read it again. The prophecy said, "When the blood of the first wolves runs in the veins of one who walks between two worlds, and that one is bound to the Alpha's heart, the kingdom shall face its final test, in fire or in unity, in ruin or in peace. The choice will belong to the one who was never meant to be, and yet was always meant to arrive. The one who walks between two worlds," Herdis said slowly. "Half wolf," Ralph said quietly. "Half human. It describes you. Exactly you." She closed the book. She needed a moment. She allowed herself that moment by looking out the tall library window at the sky, which was doing its usual violet at dusk performance, as though the world were not currently rearranging itself around her. "What does 'bound to the Alpha's heart' mean?" she asked. "I think you know what it means," Ralph said. She did. Of course she did. She just was not prepared to say it yet. "The bond I felt last night," he said, "when I caught your scent, that was not coincidence or curiosity. Wolves know their fated mate by scent. It is not a myth or a tradition. It is biology. And your scent." He stopped, pressed his fingers together briefly. "In 16 years, I have sat through every mating ceremony in this kingdom. I have not once felt what I felt last night." The honesty of it was almost startling. He said it simply, without decoration, but without the kind of flattery that men sometimes deployed like weapons. Just the plain, clear truth, offered openly. "I need you to know," Herdis said carefully, "that I have spent my entire life being invisible. I don't want to be anyone's prophecy. I don't want to be anyone's symbol. I am a person. I have a life. I have a cottage by the river and a friend who brings me bread at 7 in the morning, and I know," Ralph said, "I am not asking you to be a symbol. I am telling you what I found, because you deserve to know the truth about your own blood. What you do with it is entirely your choice." He looked at her steadily. "I only ask that you do not disappear. Not yet." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the locked door at the back of her mind, the one that had started cracking open last night. "Wait, I won't disappear," she said. "Not yet." It was not a promise of anything grand, but in that library, with the old books watching, it felt like the beginning of one. Word travelled in a kingdom, the way fire travels in dry grass. Fast, indiscriminate, and with a heat that surprised everyone who had not thought to clear the brush beforehand. Within 48 hours of Herdis's visit to the palace, the entire court knew. Within 72 hours, the council had requested an emergency meeting. Ralph had granted it, which surprised Kastner, who had expected him to delay. "You want to face them now?" Kastner asked, on the morning of the meeting, adjusting the royal seal on the council table, with the slight, nervous precision of a man who did not fidget, but was currently fidgeting. "Better now than later," Ralph said. "Just let them say everything they need to say. I'd rather know what they're thinking to my face than hear it through the walls." The council met in the great stone chamber beneath the palace, a room that had not been designed to be comfortable. Cold floor, high walls, the kind of deliberate austerity meant to communicate seriousness. The council members were seated in a semicircle, dressed in formal robes. They were all older than Ralph. Most of them had served under his father. Several of them had spent the last decade treating the young Alpha King with the specific kind of cautious deference that people offer to power they privately believe they understand better than its current holder. The eldest among them, a broad-shouldered man with grey at his temples, spoke first. "The situation is unprecedented," he said. "The Alpha King has shown marked personal interest in an unregistered half-blood. This creates 3 problems. First, it undermines the integrity of the mating ceremony. Second, it suggests the king is willing to disregard purity traditions that have protected this kingdom's bloodlines for 5 centuries. Third, interrupted another council member, a sharp-faced woman in deep blue robes. It has given the rogue factions in the Western Territories exactly the kind of destabilization they have been waiting for. There are already reports of gatherings, of rallying. The name Solvain is being spoken in places it has not been spoken in decades." This produced a visible stir around the table. Ralph waited until it subsided. He had a particular way of waiting, not passive, not restless, but entirely deliberate, as though silence were simply another tool available to him. "The prophecy," he said, "is in our own archive, written by our own historians. I have read it in full. If the council has not, I recommend doing so before continuing to call this situation unprecedented." A pause around the table. "Prophecies can be interpreted many ways," the sharp-faced woman said carefully. "They can," Ralph agreed. "This one cannot. It is specific. The bloodline is confirmed. The bond is real." He looked around the table. "And before anyone suggests that we resolve this by quietly removing Herdis from the situation, she is under my protection, formally. As of this morning, I have entered it into the royal record." The chamber went very still. "That is," the eldest council member began. "My decision," Ralph said, "made within my authority as Alpha King, which I believe still stands." He said it without anger. That was the thing about Ralph that no one had ever quite found a way to argue against. He was never emotional when emotion would have given people something to dismiss. He was always, precisely and infuriatingly, calm. Kastner, standing to the side of the room, permitted himself a very small exhale of something that was almost pride. The meeting concluded without resolution, which Ralph had expected. What he had wanted was not resolution, but information. To see who said what, who hesitated, who looked at whom when they thought he wasn't watching. That information which he would share with Kastner later in careful and specific detail, was worth considerably more than anything the council might have voted on. What Ralph didn't know, what neither he nor Kastner knew yet, was that one council member had slipped out of the chamber 10 minutes before the meeting ended and made a quiet journey to a particular messenger route that bypassed the palace's usual channels. A message was sent west that afternoon. The rebellion had just received its invitation. The visits to the palace became a quiet routine. Every few days in the afternoons, Herdis would arrive at the library. Ralph would already be there, usually with 2 cups of something hot and several books open on the table. They would read together and talk and argue, not unpleasantly, but with the specific, productive friction of 2 people who think differently and are both interested enough to keep going. She learned things about him that the kingdom didn't know, that he had become Alpha King at 19, 2 weeks after his father died of a battle wound that had not seemed serious at first, that he had not slept a full night for the first 3 years of his rule, spending the dark hours reading his father's governance notes, trying to understand a kingdom he had been handed before he felt ready for it, or that the story of his confidence, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way the room rearranged itself around him, was not something he had been born with, but something he had constructed, deliberately, from necessity, the way people construct shelters when the weather turns. "You built all of that on purpose," she said, one afternoon when he had told her, briefly and without self-pity, about those first 3 years. "I did," he said. "That's one of the loneliest things I've ever heard," she said. She had not intended to say it. It was simply true, and the truth had slipped out before she could stop it. He looked at her for a moment. "It was," he said. Past tense, though. More recently. She understood what he meant. She was not sure what to do with understanding it. She filed it somewhere she could look at later. He learned things about her, too, that she had raised herself largely on books and stubbornness after her mother died, that she had, despite everything, never been bitter. Not about her father leaving, not about the kingdom's rejections, not about any of it, in a way that he found both admirable and slightly bewildering. "How?" he asked her once. "How are you not angry?" "I was," she said honestly, "for a long time. But anger is expensive. It costs more than I had. So I learned to use what I was given and build something with it. My mother taught me that. Before she stopped. Started again. She said, 'You can spend your life resenting what was taken from you, or you can spend it building what was never given to you. The first one makes you feel righteous. The second one makes you free.'" Ralph was quiet for a moment. Or then, "Your mother was remarkable." "She was," Herdis said. "She loved a man who didn't deserve it. But that doesn't undo who she was." That was the kind of thing she said that startled him, regularly, the clean, undefended honesty of it. He had spent 16 years surrounded by people who spoke in careful, layered language, where nothing meant only what it appeared to mean. She simply said things. It was, he had come to realize, one of the bravest things he had ever witnessed. Meanwhile, in the outer city and beyond, things were moving. The rogue Western packs had been gathering for 3 months under the leadership of a wolf named Dre, not a name Ralph's council had flagged as significant, which was itself a failure of intelligence they would come to regret. Dre was not particularly large or powerful. What he was persuasive. He had built his following not on strength, but on grievance, and there was no shortage of grievance to build with. The traditions that the old packs believed the Alpha King was dismantling, the prophecy that terrified those who had built their identity on pure bloodlines, the suggestion, whispered at first and then louder, that a half-blood mate at the side of the Alpha King was an insult to everything Dareth stood for. It was, of course, lies dressed in the clothes of tradition. That was what grievance politics always were. But Dre understood something important. People who feel overlooked will follow the first voice that tells them their anger is justified, regardless of whether that voice is pointing them in any direction worth going. The rebellion was not yet violent. Not yet. But it was loud, and it was organized, and it was coming. Eichel heard whispers of it first, at a gathering outside the city. He came to Herdis's cottage the following morning, earlier than usual, his usual steady expression carrying something she hadn't seen on his face in many years. Worry. There are people saying your name in places they shouldn't know, he said. Not kindly, Herdis. She made him sit down. She made him tea. She listened to everything he had heard. And then, that same afternoon, she walked to the palace and told Ralph. Not because she needed him to protect her. Because the rebellion was not just her problem. It was the kingdom's problem. And she had decided, somewhere between the library conversations and the quietly acknowledged thing that neither of them had named out loud yet, that she was not going to stand on the sidelines of Dareth's story anymore. And she had spent long enough being invisible. It had never actually kept her safe. It had only kept her small. The attack came on a Thursday night, which felt somehow wrong, as though major crises should have the decency to arrive on more dramatic days of the week. It was not a siege. It was a demonstration, which was, in some ways, more frightening. 300 rogue wolves gathered at the gates of the capital city, torches burning, voices raised, the name of the Solvane prophecy ringing off the stone walls like a war drum. They did not try to force entry. They stood and they shouted, and they made certain the palace could hear every word. Inside the palace, the council was in emergency session. The war room was lit bright, maps spread across every surface, Ralph standing at the head of the table with Kastner at his shoulder, though 3 palace guards had already been stationed at every entrance. "Do not engage," Ralph said, before anyone could suggest otherwise. "This is performance. They want a confrontation that they can use. Do not give them one." "With respect," said the eldest council member. "Inaction communicates weakness." "Inaction and patience are not the same thing," Ralph said. "We hold the walls. We identify their leadership. We respond when we choose to, on our terms, not theirs." He was right. He was also aware, as he said it, that the council members were watching him with an assessment in their eyes that had nothing to do with the rebels outside the gates. They were measuring him, deciding whether the Alpha King who had aligned himself with a half-blood was still the Alpha King they had pledged themselves to. Herdis was in the palace. She had been with Janina in a receiving room on the 2nd floor when the noise had started. Janina had gone immediately pale, and Herdis had stood at the window and listened to the crowd chanting her name, her actual name, which was not something she had expected, with a strange composite feeling that she could not fully identify. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that had no good name, except maybe, "I will not flinch." A palace guard came to escort her to the protected inner rooms. She thanked him and declined. "Herdis," Janina began. "I'm not going to hide," Herdis said quietly. "I've hidden my whole life. It didn't make them stop talking. It just meant I couldn't hear what they were saying." She found Ralph in the war room, but he saw her come through the door, and the only thing that crossed his face was something she might have called relief if she were being honest with herself, which she was trying to be, more and more. "You should be somewhere safer," he said. "Probably," she agreed, coming to stand beside him at the map table. "What are we looking at?" He watched her for a moment. The way she looked at the map, the steadiness in her posture, the complete absence of performance in her. Then he told her what they knew. She listened. She asked 3 questions, each of which identified a piece of the picture that had not been clearly named. Kastner, who had been standing at the side of the room, making quiet notes, looked up after the 3rd question with an expression that was something like revised opinion. The crowd outside eventually dispersed at dawn, much as Ralph had predicted. Not because they had been defeated, because they had made their point and had no tactical reason to stay. They would be back. As the palace settled and the council members retired and the guards rotated shifts, Ralph and Herdis were left standing in the war room, the maps still spread between them, the candles burned down to stubs. "Are you afraid?" he asked her. "Yes," she said, "but I've been afraid my entire life. I know how to function in it." "I know," he said softly. And then, because they had spent weeks being carefully honest with each other, and it was either the right moment or there would not be a right moment, he said, "I don't want you to have to be alone in it any more." She looked at him. He looked at her. The candles threw their shadows long across the stone floor. "That's either the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, "or you are very bad at emotional declarations." "Both are possibly true," he said, and she laughed, and this time she did not cover it with her hand. The council meeting that followed the demonstration was different from the first one. The tone had shifted, not toward Ralph, not toward support for Herdis, but toward urgency, the kind that compresses people into positions they might not otherwise have taken. 2 council members formally requested that Ralph dissolve his personal connection to Herdis, citing in careful and elaborate language the threat to kingdom stability. They presented it as a concern. The sharp-faced woman in blue robes, whose name was Edelind, went further. She proposed a formal measure that the Alpha King's mate must be chosen from a list of pre-approved bloodline candidates, ratified by the council. It was, as measures went, a masterpiece of overreach dressed as protocol. Ralph let the proposal be read in full. He let the table discuss it. He waited until every variation of the argument had been made. Then he said very quietly, "The authority to determine the Alpha King's mate has never, in 500 years of Dareth's history, belonged to the council. I would encourage everyone in this room to reread the founding charter before this conversation continues. Kastner has copies available." Kastner, with the serenity of someone who had been quietly holding this information all morning like a card in reserve, produced copies of the founding charter. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Edelind, on her way out, passed close enough to Kastner to say, very quietly, "He's going to destroy this kingdom over a half-blood girl." Kastner, who had served Ralph since he was 19 and had watched him build himself into a king from the shattered pieces of his father's sudden death, said simply, "Or she's going to save it." He believed it too, not because prophecy said so, but because he had watched Herdis in the war room asking questions that half his trained intelligence staff had failed to ask, standing at the window listening to a crowd scream her name and not flinching. There was something in her that the kingdom needed, and it was not bloodline purity or political convenience. It was the specific, unbreakable quality of someone who had been through the worst and came out the other side still choosing to build rather than burn. But Edelind's comment was logged, and 3 days later, or when a report arrived indicating that the rogue Western Pax had been receiving information from inside the palace, intelligence about schedules, about Herdis's movements, about council meeting contents, Kastner pulled that log and set it on Ralph's desk with a single piece of paper that said, "The traitor is on the council." Ralph read it once. Set it down. "How sure are you?" he asked. "The timing of the leaks corresponds to every meeting she has attended, and no meetings she has missed." And, Kastner added, "I had someone monitor the messenger routes from the palace the night she proposed the bloodline measure. The same routes that were used to contact the rebels 3 months ago." "Don't move on it yet," Ralph said. "Not until we have enough to be irrefutable. I want it airtight. I will not have anyone say this was a political elimination." "Understood," Kastner said. "It will be airtight." In the outer city, Eichel had begun working quietly. Not as a spy, not as a soldier, but as himself. A trusted, mild-mannered wolf who had grown up on the outskirts and was known to everyone. He walked the market streets and the gathering places, listening, gathering the shape of public feeling. Most people, he found, did not particularly care about Herdy's bloodline. Most people were worried about the harvest, about the trade roads, about whether the rebellion would bring violence to their streets. That was the truth the council did not want to face. The majority of Dareth's people were not ideologues. They were ordinary people who wanted safety and stability, and right now those things felt uncertain. But the rebellion was not a popular revolution. It was a loud minority, wielding a grievance as a weapon. Eichel brought this information to Herdis. Herdis brought it to Ralph. And Ralph, sitting with it, understood something important. The answer to the rebellion was not military force. It was visibility. It was Dareth's people being reminded of who actually governed them and what that governance was producing. "I want to do a public address," Ralph said, "in the outer city square. Not from the palace balcony. From the square itself, among the people." Kastner opened his mouth. "With Herdis beside me," Ralph finished. Kastner closed his mouth. Then I opened it again. "That will either be the most effective thing you've ever done, or the most dangerous." "Yes," Ralph said. "That's true of most important things." The morning of the public address, Herdy stood in front of the small mirror in her palace guest room and had a conversation with herself. It went like this. "You are a half-wolf orphan from the outskirts of the kingdom. You have never wanted attention or power or any of this. You are wearing a gown that was made for you by the palace seamstress in 3 days, and it is the most beautiful thing you have ever owned, and you are terrified, and that is completely reasonable. But listen, you have been afraid before. You have been alone before. You have been rejected and dismissed and made to feel like a mistake that should apologize for existing. And you are still here. You are still standing. And the woman who survived all of that is not going to crumble in a city square. She did her own hair. She had always done her own hair. The dark brown waves with their threads of silver fell over her shoulders, and she left them down, and she walked out of the room. Ralph was waiting in the corridor. He had been there for 10 minutes, Kastner had mentioned, which meant he had been early, which meant he had been nervous, which she found unexpectedly steadying. He looked at her when she came out of the room. Something in his expression did what it always did when he looked at her. Simplified. The king face dropped. He was just a person looking at someone that mattered to him. "You look," he started. "Do not make it weird," she said. "We both have enough to manage today." "Beautiful," he finished, refusing to be redirected. "You look exactly like someone who is about to walk into a city square and remind a kingdom who they are." She considered this. That was actually quite good. "I have them occasionally," he said. She took his offered arm, and they walked. The square was full. Not with rebels, with citizens, merchants, families, young wolves and old ones, workers from the outer districts, people who had heard that the Alpha King was coming to speak in person and had come to see. There was tension in the crowd, the kind that came from uncertainty rather than hostility. These were people who wanted to understand what was happening to their kingdom. When Ralph stepped onto the low platform at the center of the square, the crowd stilled. When Herdy stepped up beside him, the stilling deepened. Not into hostility, but into something more complex, or assessment, curiosity. Ralph spoke first. He spoke about Dareth, its history, its founding, the Solvane wolves whose names were in every archive, but whose story had been quietly filed away. He spoke plainly, without the elevated language of formal decrees, in the voice of someone having a real conversation with people he genuinely owed honesty. Then he said, "This is Herdis. She is from your outskirts. She's the daughter of a Dareth wolf and a human man, which makes her both, not lesser, not dangerous, but both. She carries the oldest bloodline in this kingdom in her veins, and she is the person standing beside me because she is the person who belongs there. Not because of prophecy, though the prophecy is real. Because of who she is, which I have had the privilege of learning over these past weeks." He stepped back. Herdis looked at the crowd. 500 faces, maybe more. Some are wary. Some are openly curious. Some of them were people who had known her at the outer market for years, who were looking at her now with new eyes, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the woman standing here. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had prepared something. The prepared thing suddenly felt wrong, too formal, too constructed. So she said the true thing instead. "I grew up believing I was a mistake," she said, and her voice carried in the square the way voices carry when they are not performing. "I grew up at the edge of this kingdom being told, not in words, but in every other way that mattered, that I didn't belong here, and I believed it. For a very long time, I believed it. I stayed small, and I stayed quiet, because I thought that was the price of being tolerated." She paused. "What I know now is that the kingdom that told me I didn't belong, that kingdom has my ancestors at its foundation. The first wolves of Dareth are my family. This land, the same land I was kept at the edge of, is as much mine as anyone's." She looked at the faces in front of her. "I'm not standing here because I want power. I'm standing here because hiding was never actually safe, and I am done paying the cost of other people's fear. The rebellion that's gathering outside your gates, they are not protecting tradition. They are protecting a hierarchy that benefits them, dressed up as tradition so it sounds noble. Don't be fooled by the clothing. Look at what it's actually doing and who it's actually serving." Silence. Then, and from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone began to clap. Then another. Then the sound built. Not thunderous, not unanimous, but real, sustained, genuine. The sound of people who had heard something true and recognized it. Beside her, Ralph was quiet. When she glanced at him, his golden eyes were bright with something she was now experienced enough to recognize. He was proud of her, completely, undisguisedly proud of her, the way people are proud of things they had nothing to do with, but feel honored to witness. She looked forward again. She breathed. 3 days later, Kastner delivered the evidence to Ralph. It was airtight, as promised. Edelind had been feeding information to the rebellion for 4 months. Her motivations were, ultimately, what base motivations always were. She had backed a candidate for Alpha King before Ralph's father died, and she had never recovered from losing that campaign. The rebellion was not her belief. It was her revenge. She was removed from the council. She was tried according to Dareth's law, not cruelly, not with theatre, but fully and fairly, and sentenced to 10 years' exile in the Eastern Territories. She would live. She would be safe. She would simply not be her, which was, as consequences went, precisely proportionate. The rogue Western Pax, deprived of their inside intelligence and faced with a public that had heard Herdis speak and responded with something other than the rejection the rebellion had promised, began to fracture. Dre attempted 3 more rallies. The first 2 drew modest crowds. The third drew almost no one. Without an enemy to unite them against, a movement built on grievance had nothing left to offer. The rebellion did not end with a battle. It ended with irrelevance, which was a less dramatic conclusion, but a more permanent one. Dre was brought before Ralph, finally, when he attempted to cross into the capital with 12 followers and was intercepted at the city gate. He had expected confrontation. What he received instead was a formal hearing, a clear accounting of his actions, a sentence of 5 years community service in the outer districts, building the very infrastructure that the outer city had been denied for decades, and the words from Ralph, "You had real grievances. Some of the conditions in the Western Territories are genuinely unjust, and that is a failure of this court. We will address them, but the path you chose solved nothing and hurt people who trusted you. You will spend the next 5 years making that right." It was the kind of justice that made people uncomfortable because it was harder to argue against than punishment. It was fair. It was practical. And it was exactly the kind of thing that Herdis had talked about in the library, in those early conversations, when she had described her mother's philosophy. Build what was never given. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if this story has moved you, or even just made you smile at least once, then we did exactly what we set out to do. Before we reach the ending that Herdis deserves, we want to pause one more time and speak directly to you. Thank you for staying. You watched this all the way through, and that matters more than you know. Stories about identity, belonging, and the courage to stop making yourself small. These stories only travel as far as the people who carry them. You can carry this one. If you have not yet subscribed, please do that right now. Hit the like button if this story earned it. And drop a comment below. Now, let's finish this story. Because Herdis has earned her ending. The second mating ceremony of that year was nothing like the first one. It was held in the outer city square, not in the grand hall of the palace, but in the open air, under the harvest moon, in the place where Herdis had stood and told the truth to 500 people 3 months before. Ralph had suggested it. Kastner had noted, with something approaching dry humor, that it was logistically unconventional. Ralph had said the convention had needed adjusting for some time. The crowd was larger than 500 this time. It was the full city, wolves and the humans who lived among them, and the people from the outer districts who had never been invited to a royal ceremony before, but had been formally included in this one. Eichel stood near the front with his bonded mate, beaming in the specific way of people who love their friends and feel personally vindicated by their happiness. And Janina stood beside him, wearing the most elaborately beautiful dress she had owned in her life, which she had commissioned specifically for this occasion approximately 4 days after Herdis had first gone to the palace. "I knew," she said, when Herdis found out. "I knew at the ceremony when he sat down. I put in the order the next morning." "That's terrifying," Herdis said. "It's efficient," Janina said. Kastner, standing at his place beside the royal platform, wore his usual dark robes and his usual expression of controlled authority. But when the moment came, when Herdis walked through the crowd to stand before Ralph, and Ralph looked at her with those golden eyes that had no king face in them at all, only a person. Kastner permitted himself, for perhaps the third time in 16 years of service, a genuine smile. The bonding ceremony for the Alpha King and his mate was one of the oldest rituals in Dareth. It was spoken in the old language, the one the Solvane wolves had brought to these lands 5 centuries ago. The words were a promise, not of possession, not of obligation, but of partnership, of choosing to stand beside rather than above, of committing to build together rather than separately. Ralph spoke his part first. His voice was steady and low and carried the way his voice always carried, completely, without effort. He looked at Hadis the whole time, not at the crowd, not at the council members who had been reassembled in their reduced form, not at the historical record of the moment. At her. When it was her turn, Hadis spoke in the old language and also in the plain language, because she had decided the plain language deserved to be in the record too. "I spent most of my life trying to disappear," she said. "I thought that was the safest thing I could do. Make myself so small that no one could find me to hurt me. What I know now is that disappearing was never safe. It was just a different kind of loss. I was losing myself piece by piece, trying to protect something that was already shrinking." She looked at Ralph. "You found me anyway," she said, which I will point out was not particularly convenient at the time. A sound of laughter moved through the crowd, warm and real. "But I am glad you did. I am glad for all of it. Even the frightening parts, even the parts that cost me sleep, even the crowd outside the gates, because it brought me here. And here is the first place I have stood and felt, or completely and without apology, that I belong." The moon hung fat and full over the outer city square of Dareth. The crowd was quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something true is happening. Not the silence of held breath, but the silence of witnesses, of people who understood they were watching something that would be remembered. Ralph reached out and took her hand, and Hadis, who had spent 23 years at the edges of a world that had not wanted her, stood at its center. Not because she had fought her way there, not because she had been given permission, but because she had finally decided that she was worth the space. The prophecy had not been wrong. The kingdom had faced its final test, not on fire, in unity. The choice had belonged to the one who was never meant to be, and she had chosen well. Not all at once, not without friction, but meaningfully, in ways that compounded over time the way small corrections in a long journey eventually move you somewhere entirely different than where you had been headed. The outer districts received the trade road investment they had been petitioning for since Ralph's father's reign. The registry was reformed, not eliminated, but expanded, so that half-bloods and those of mixed heritage were formally included, their bloodlines documented and valued rather than erased. Eichel, whose quiet work during the rebellion had been noticed by those paying attention, was appointed to a newly created position in the Outer City Governance Council, a practical man for practical problems, which he had always been. Janina opened a business. Of course she did. It was a textile shop that somehow became one of the most successful establishments in the capital within 2 years. She attributed this to product quality. Everyone who knew her attributed it to the fact that no one on earth was better at making people feel welcome and seen when they walked through a door. Kastner continued his work. He would continue it for many years. He had, in the end, served 2 generations of Alpha Kings, and what he had learned from both was this: the health of a kingdom was not measured by the stability of its traditions, but by the fairness of its treatment of those at its edges. A kingdom that protected its weakest members was a kingdom that had earned its own continuation. One that did not was borrowing time. He wrote it down, eventually. It became part of the governance record that future leaders of Dareth would read. Herdis and Ralph, the Alpha King and the mate who was never meant to be, built something together that neither of them could have built alone. That was the point, of course. That was always the point. Two people who had each been, in their own way, carrying the full weight of something that was not meant to be carried alone, finally putting it down and picking it up together. She still had her cottage by the river. She went there sometimes, when she needed to think, when the palace's noise became too much. She would sit at the small kitchen table, with both hands around a warm cup, looking out at the water. And she would think about the girl who had lived here and believed herself to be invisible. That girl had been wrong about almost everything. Or she had been wrong about being invisible. She had been seen, always, by the people who mattered. By her mother, who had believed in her completely. By Eichel, who had never once looked at her like a burden. By Janina, who had commissioned a dress the morning after a chance encounter, because she already knew what was coming. She had been wrong about not belonging. She had belonged to this land since the very beginning, at the molecular level, in a way that no tradition and no hierarchy and no crowd outside a gate could change or remove. And she had been wrong about hiding being safe. That was the one she spent the most time with in those quiet river mornings, the years she had spent making herself small, thinking that smallness was a form of protection. It was not. It was a form of loss. And the thing about loss is that you can grieve it, and you can learn from it, and you can carry it forward as a lesson, but you cannot get the time back. You can only use what remains. She had. She would. That was enough. That had always been more than enough. Stories like Herdis's are not only fantasy, they are mirrors. Every day, real people navigate versions of what Herdis navigated, being told they do not belong, being made to feel that their mixed identity, their unusual background, their between worlds nature is a liability rather than a strength. Every day, people make themselves small because they have been taught that smallness is the cost of being tolerated. What Herdis's story teaches is this: your heritage does not make you less. The things that make you different from those who hold power are not flaws, but they are often the very things that allow you to see what those in power cannot see, because you have lived at the edges where the light hits differently, and that perspective has value. It also teaches something about the mechanics of manipulation. The rebellion in this story was built on grievance, real grievance, transformed into a weapon by someone who needed followers more than they needed truth. This is not a fantasy mechanic. It is a documented pattern in human history, deployed in every era and every culture. Take a legitimate hurt, amplify it, point it at a target, and use the energy of people's pain for your own purposes. The defense against it is not silence. It is visibility, clarity, and the willingness to distinguish between the real concern and the agenda attached to it. And finally, it teaches something about the importance of finding your people. Herdis could not have done what she did without Janina's loyalty, Eichel's steadiness, Ralph's honesty, or Kostner's quiet, principled service. None of us are meant to carry our full weight alone. The people who see us clearly and stand with us anyway, those people are not optional. They are essential. Invest in them accordingly. And that is where we leave Herdis and Ralph, not at some perfect, frictionless forever, but at something better, a real life, built together, still in progress, A kingdom that is learning to be worthy of the people inside it. A woman who stopped apologizing for the space she occupied and started filling it on purpose. That is the story of a hidden legacy, the alpha's mate who was never meant to be. We hope it moved you. We hope it made you laugh at least once. We hope it made you think about the places in your own life where you have been making yourself smaller than you actually are. If it did any of those things, then this story has done its job. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below to let us know where you are watching from. We will love to say hello to you, because knowing how far our story has traveled, knowing which part of the world you are in right now reading these words or hearing this voice, that is one of the best parts of what we do. So drop your location in the comments. We will find you. We will say hello. Thank you for being here. Until the next story.